Hello everyone. If you love heartwarming animal stories and want to follow the inspiring journey of these adorable friends, don't forget to hit the subscribe button now so you won't miss any of our videos. Now, let's dive into today's emotional story. Jake never liked dogs. It wasn't fear. It was something deeper, a wound left by the past. When he was 5, a neighbor's wolf dog had snapped at him, its teeth grazing his leg before anyone could stop it. The bite hadn't been deep, but it had left a scar not just on his skin, but in his heart. Since that day, he had avoided dogs entirely, refusing to go near them, no matter how friendly they seemed. So, when his parents announced a weekend camping trip, Jake was less than thrilled. "Do we really have to go?" he groaned, slumping in the back seat of the car. His father chuckled. "Come on, kid. It'll be fun. Fresh air, adventure, way better than staring at a screen all day." Jake rolled his eyes. He'd rather be at home, playing video games or doing anything that didn't involve sleeping outside with bugs. By the time they arrived at Cedarwood National Park, the sun was beginning to dip behind the trees, casting golden streaks of light through the forest. The air smelled of pine and earth, and somewhere in the distance, the soft trickle of a stream echoed through the quiet. To his parents, it was peaceful. To Jake, it was just another place where he didn't belong. His father and mother started setting up their tent, chatting and laughing as they worked. But Jake just sat on a fallen log, kicking a rock, completely uninterested. He didn't want to roast marshmallows. He didn't want to tell stories by the fire. And he definitely didn't want to be there. As the sky darkened, a chilly breeze swept through the trees. His father lit a campfire, and the warmth of the flames flickered against their faces. His mother handed him a stick with a marshmallow on it, smiling. "Come on, Jake," she said gently. "Just try to enjoy it." Jake sighed but took the stick anyway. He didn't want to disappoint her. But just as he reached forward to toast his marshmallow, something rustled in the woods. It was faint, so soft that his parents didn't even seem to hear it. But Jake did. He turned his head, staring into the trees. At first, there was nothing. Just shadows stretching long across the forest floor. Then a flicker of movement. Jake's stomach twisted. A dog. It stood at the edge of the clearing, its body half hidden in the undergrowth. Its fur was dirty, matted with leaves and dust, and its eyes, one brown, one a soft amber hue, stared directly at him. Jake froze. It wasn't growling. It wasn't moving closer. It just stood there, watching. His chest tightened. He gripped the stick in his hands. No. Not a dog. Not here. He tore his gaze away and turned back to the fire, forcing himself to ignore it. "Jake?" his mother asked, noticing his pale face. "Are you okay?" "Yeah," he muttered, shoving the marshmallow into his mouth. "I'm fine." But he wasn't. And somewhere deep in the woods, the dog continued to watch. The fire crackled, warming Jake's hands as his parents chatted about hiking trails for the next day. But he wasn't listening. His mind was stuck on the dog in the woods. Had it been wild? Had it been lost? And why had it been watching him? He shook his head. "Not my problem." As his parents continued talking, Jake slowly stood. "I'm going to stretch my legs," he announced. His father nodded. "Stay close, kid." Jake nodded, stepping away from the fire and following a small dirt path between the trees. He didn't plan on going far, just enough to breathe, to clear his head. But with each step, the quiet of the forest grew heavier. The sounds of the fire and his parents' voices faded behind him. He could hear his own breathing, the crunch of leaves beneath his sneakers. Then a noise. Soft. A whimper. Jake's feet stopped. He turned his head, eyes scanning the darkness. There, near a large fallen tree, was the dog. Closer this time. Jake's pulse quickened. "Go away," he muttered, barely above a whisper. The dog didn't move. It just stared at him, not with fear, not with aggression, but with something else. Understanding. Jake swallowed, his fingers curling into fists. He should walk away. But instead he took one step closer. And that was his mistake. Because in the next instant, the ground beneath his foot vanished. A sharp gasp ripped from his throat as he felt himself falling, his body tumbling down a steep incline he hadn't noticed in the dark. Leaves and branches scratched at his arms, his legs, as he crashed downward. The world spun. Then impact. Pain shot through his side as he hit the ground hard, the breath knocked from his lungs. For a few seconds, all he could do was lie there, dazed. When he finally opened his eyes, he realized where he was. Deep in the forest. Alone. His stomach twisted. He scrambled to his feet, heart pounding as he looked around. Everything looked the same. The trees stretched tall and endless. The sky was barely visible through the thick canopy. There was no sign of the campsite. No sign of his parents. Panic set in. He had no flashlight. No map. He was lost. And no one knew where he was. Jake sucked in a shaky breath, trying to fight the fear rising in his chest. Then a sound. Not the wind. Not the trees. Something closer. A soft, steady panting. Jake turned. The dog. It stood a few feet away, its eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. Jake's breath hitched. And then the dog did something unexpected. It wagged its tail. And walked toward him. Jake staggered backward, his heart pounding in his chest. The dog, the same one that had been watching him near the campsite, now stood just a few feet away, its tail wagging slowly, ears perked forward. Jake's breath came fast and uneven. Was it dangerous? It didn't look aggressive. Its eyes held no malice, no threat, just curiosity. But still, it was a dog. And Jake didn't trust dogs. He turned in a slow circle, trying to figure out where he had fallen from. But the trees looked the same in every direction. The sky above was only a sliver of darkness between thick, towering branches. His stomach tightened. I have to find my way back. Swallowing hard, Jake picked a direction and started walking. His sneakers crunched over fallen leaves and snapped twigs. His hands trembled, the chill of the night sinking into his skin. And behind him soft footsteps followed. Jake froze. He turned his head sharply. The dog was still there, trailing behind him at a careful distance. Jaw. "Go away," he muttered. The dog just tilted its head. Jake huffed and kept walking, forcing himself to ignore it. But no matter how far he went, no matter how many times he changed direction, the dog never left. After what felt like an eternity, Jake's hands were shaking. His breath came out in harsh gasps, and his legs burned from stumbling over tree roots and uneven ground. Still no sign of the campsite. No sign of his parents. His throat tightened. He was completely lost. For the first time, real fear settled in his chest. What if they couldn't find him? What if he had walked too far? Jake squeezed his eyes shut, willing himself not to cry. Then a low whimper. His eyes snapped open. The dog had stepped closer, watching him carefully. Jake took a shaky breath. "I said go away," he whispered, but this time, there was less anger in his voice. The dog didn't move. And for some reason, Jake didn't push it away again. His legs felt weak, and he sank down onto a fallen log, defeated. The night air was getting colder, and the forest around him felt endless. He pulled his jacket tighter, but it wasn't enough. A shiver ran through him. Then, soft warmth pressed against his side. Jake flinched. The dog had moved closer and curled up beside him, pressing its body against his to share warmth. Jake's breath hitched. He didn't move. The dog wasn't hurting him. It was helping him. And for the first time since falling into the woods, he wasn't entirely alone. Minutes stretched on, and the cold became bearable with the dog beside him. Jake stared down at it. Its fur was rough, tangled. Not a stray but abandoned. A collar still hung loosely around its neck, the metal rusted, unreadable in the dim light. Who had left it? Why was it out here? And why out of all the people it could have followed had it chosen him? Jake swallowed. Maybe they weren't so different. Both lost. Both alone. Both forgotten. The dog let out a deep sigh, curling tighter against him. For the first time, Jake didn't push it away. Instead, he let the warmth sink into his frozen limbs. He wasn't ready to trust it, not yet. But maybe, just maybe, he didn't have to be afraid. And maybe, just maybe, he wasn't as alone as he thought. The night dragged on, stretching endlessly. The cold bit into Jake's skin, even with the warmth of the dog pressed against him. His fingers felt numb, his stomach twisted in hunger, and every small sound in the forest made his heart race. But the dog Rusty, as Jake had begun calling him in his head, never moved far. He lay curled beside Jake, ears twitching at every distant rustle, every whisper of wind through the trees. Watching. Protecting. Jake had never felt this kind of safety before. Not from an animal. Not from anyone. At some point, Jake's eyes grew too heavy to keep open. He drifted between sleep and wakefulness, jolting awake at every unfamiliar noise. But Rusty was always there, his warm body steady, his breathing slow. Sometime in the early hours of the morning, a sound cut through the silence, a distant voice. Jake's breath caught in his throat. He sat up quickly, his heart pounding. Another voice. Closer this time. Jake. It was his father's voice. Jake scrambled to his feet, his legs trembling. His father was here. "Dad," he shouted, his voice raw. "I'm here." Rusty jumped up beside him, ears perked, tail wagging slightly. Then, through the trees, a beam of light cut through the darkness, a flashlight. A second later, his father appeared, breathless, his face pale with worry. "Jake!" His voice cracked with relief. He rushed forward and pulled Jake into a tight embrace. "Oh, thank God." Jake clung to him, feeling the first real warmth since the night began. More flashlights appeared behind his father as rescuers from the campsite arrived. "We've been searching all night," one of them said. "You wandered far." Jake shook his head, still overwhelmed. I didn't mean to." Then, he remembered. Rusty. He turned quickly. "Dad, But Rusty was gone. Jake's stomach twisted. Where did he go? Jake pulled away from his father. "There was a dog," he said quickly. "He was with me all night. He kept me warm, he kept me safe." His father blinked in surprise. "A dog?" "Yes." Jake turned in frantic circles, searching the darkness. But Rusty was nowhere to be seen. The rescuers exchanged uncertain glances. "Son, we didn't see any dog when we found you," one of them said gently. Jake's chest tightened. But he was real. He was here. He felt a sting of panic. What if Rusty was still lost? What if he had wandered off, thinking Jake didn't need him anymore? Desperation clawed at Jake's throat. He took a deep breath, then whistled loudly, just like he'd seen people do when calling their dogs. Silence. The night air stretched, empty and still. And then a soft rustle. A shadow moved between the trees. Jake's heart leapt. Rusty. His tail wagged slowly, cautiously, as he stepped forward from the darkness. Jake didn't think. Didn't hesitate. For the first time in his life, he knelt down and held out his hand. "It's okay, boy," he whispered. "Come here." Rusty stopped. For a long moment, he just stood there, his brown eyes searching Jake's face. And then he moved. Slowly, Rusty stepped forward and pressed his nose into Jake's hand. Jake felt something break inside him, something that had been frozen for a long, long time. A shaky breath escaped him. He ran his fingers through Rusty's fur, feeling the coarse warmth beneath his touch. For the first time, he wasn't afraid. Rusty had saved him. And now, Jake was going to save Rusty too. The moment Rusty pressed his nose into Jake's hand, something inside the boy shifted, something deep, something warm. He had spent his whole life avoiding dogs, flinching at their barks, stepping away whenever one got too close. But this dog. Rusty was different. Rusty had stayed with him when he was alone. He had kept him warm when the cold could have hurt him. He had led him back to safety. Rusty had saved his life. And now, Jake wanted to save Rusty's. The rescuers watched in silence as Rusty pressed closer to Jake, his tail wagging just slightly. Jake looked up at his father. "Can we take him home?" His father's eyes widened. "Jake." "He has no one," Jake cut in quickly, feeling desperation rise in his chest. "He saved me. I can't just leave him." One of the rescuers cleared his throat. "Actually, the dog does have a past." Jake's brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" The man crouched down beside Rusty and gently tugged at the worn, rusted collar around his neck. It was old, scratched, and nearly unreadable. But with a bit of effort, he was able to make out the faded letters etched into the metal. "Belonged to William Harris." Jake's father exhaled sharply. "William Harris. That's a name I haven't heard in a long time." Jake looked up at him, confused. "Who was he?" "A man who lived on the outskirts of town," his father said, running a hand through his hair. "He was a kind man, always helping others. But he passed away years ago. He never had any family." Jake's stomach tightened. "So Rusty was his?" "Looks like it." The rescuer nodded. "I'm guessing after Harris passed, no one took him in. Poor thing must have been wandering ever since." He sighed, giving Rusty a small scratch behind the ear. "He's been alone for a long time." Jake's chest ached at those words. Alone. Forgotten. Abandoned. He knew that feeling too well. Rusty had no one. Just like Jake had felt for so long. Jake stood up, his mind made up. "I want to take him home," he said, voice firm. His father hesitated. "Jake, are you sure? You never even liked dogs before." Jake met his father's gaze, determination burning in his eyes. "I was wrong," he admitted. "Rusty is a good dog. He's brave. He didn't leave me when I needed him most." He swallowed hard. "I won't leave him either." Silence stretched between them. Then his father sighed. "All right," he murmured. "All right, son. We'll take him home." Jake's heart soared. Rusty must have understood, because he let out a soft bark and wagged his tail, a real wag this time, full of hope. Jake knelt beside him, wrapping his arms around the dog for the first time. Rusty leaned into him, letting out a deep, content sigh. For the first time in a long time, neither of them was alone. The ride back to town was quiet, but different from before. Jake sat in the back seat, Rusty's head resting on his lap. He ran his fingers through the dog's fur absent-mindedly, feeling something unfamiliar settle in his chest. Something warm. Something right. When they reached home, Rusty hesitated at the front step. Like he wasn't sure he belonged. Jake held the door open and patted his leg. "Come on, boy," he said. "This is your home now." Rusty looked at him for a long moment. Then, with a happy wag of his tail, he stepped inside. Jake smiled. Rusty was home. And so, for the first time in his life, Jake felt like he was home too. Weeks passed, and Rusty became more than just a pet, he became family. He followed Jake everywhere, always watching over him, just as he had that night in the forest. Whether it was lying at Jake's feet while he read, waiting by the door when he got home from school, or curling up beside his bed at night, Rusty was always there. And Jake? He wasn't the same boy who had once feared dogs. His scars both on his leg and in his heart didn't disappear overnight. But with Rusty by his side, they didn't hurt as much anymore. Because Rusty had saved him once, and in return, Jake had saved Rusty. It turned out, they had saved each other. And maybe, just maybe sometimes the things we fear the most become the things we need the most. And sometimes, those who have been forgotten just need someone to believe they're worth saving. Message of the story. We should never judge someone or something by their past. Rusty was more than just a stray, he was a soul who had been forgotten, wandering alone, waiting for someone to give him a second chance. In many ways, he was just like Jake, a boy who had always felt like an outsider, carrying his own invisible scars. But in the end, they found each other. And in doing so, they saved each other. Because the most valuable things in life aren't always the newest, the prettiest, or the most perfect. Sometimes, the things that seem broken, lost, or unwanted are the ones most worth holding on to. Rusty's collar may have been old and rusted, but it carried a story of love, of loyalty, and of a past that was waiting for a new beginning. Because sometimes, the rusted collar is the one worth keeping.